They say podcasts are going to replace books. I don't know about that, but I do think TRS clips will assist your learning process. Why don't you talk about this lack of stability in the Middle East? Like, let's go get into this part of the podcast. What happened historically? What's happening now?
So the Middle East, historically, if you go back a couple of centuries, was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was this massively powerful empire based out of Constantinople, Istanbul, and it encompassed the Middle East. It also encompassed significant parts of Europe. And the ruler was the Ottoman Sultan, the Caliph, right? Now, in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire began becoming decrepit, weak internally, right? The steel went out of the spine. The harem and the eunuchs took over in the court, and the military affairs were left to various governors, etc. So there was this massive weakness that started creeping in. In the 19th century, the Europeans called the Ottoman Empire, they called Turkey the sick man of Europe, right? So there were all these tribal factions in the Middle East, the Hashemite faction, the Syrians, lots of the different tribal factions in the Middle East that sought independence from the Turkish yoke, from the Ottoman yoke.
Why?
Because everybody wants to rule themselves. The Arabs did not want to be ruled by Turks, right?
It's just ethnic rivalry.
It's an ethnic thing. I want to be ruled by myself. I want self-determination, autonomy, all that. And it's also about power, control, prestige, wealth, all those things. Yeah, why should they be wealthy at our expense? Let's keep our wealth for ourselves and that sort of thing. Then the First World War happened. Turkey sided with Germany. It was defeated. It was nearly partitioned and broken apart. But Mustafa Kemal Atatürk ensured that the West was defeated, and he created a smaller nation of Turkey out of it. In the second half of the First World War, the British promised the ruler of Mecca that they would support an independent Arabian nation, a Saudi Arabia, essentially, if they provided support to the British against the Ottoman Empire. So the British fomented these divisions. They old divide and rule policy.
What was in Saudi Arabia back then?
Oil.
But what was it as a country? Like, what was it called?
There was a region called the Transjordan. There was a region called, there was a Meccan kingdom.
Okay.
Various kingdoms were there in this region.
Like tinier countries.
Smaller. But they took one of these guys as their client, and they promised him the entire peninsula. Essentially the entire peninsula in exchange for support to the British against the Ottoman Empire. Because until that time, the Ottoman Empire still ruled over this region. And the British sought this because of the very strategic Suez Canal. Right? So they had already taken ownership of Suez and the Suez Canal region from the Egyptians, because the Egyptian economy was, engineered into a near bankruptcy. And that's why the ruler of Egypt was forced to sell his stake in the Suez Canal company to the British. And the British took over. The Suez Canal was built in 1859 or 69 or something like that.
Very rookie input here, but this is for people who are hearing the word Suez Canal for the first time. Basically, your naval trade is very important for your economy, and the naval trade for the British, especially when they're importing things from India and Asia in general, they would have to go around South Africa, which is a much more dangerous sea route. There's piracy, there is storms, etc., etc. Suez Canal gives you a shortcut. So
massive shortcut.
Yeah, it saves money, it ensures safety, etc., etc. It's just an easier way of naval trade. Let's get back to AC.
So the Suez Canal was called the spinal cord of the British Empire. That's how they connected to India. That's how they stole and plundered the wealth out of India and transferred it to the UK. So Suez was strategically vital to the British Empire, to the continuation of the British Empire. And for that, they needed access and control to the surrounding regions like the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, all that. So they fomented these problems, these revolts against the Ottoman Empire, etc. Then the Ottoman Empire crumbled at the end of World War I, which is when these various kingdoms were formed. So the British created this mandate of Palestine, I think they called it. And they created this artificial nation of Iraq. So Iraq is almost 50% Shia. And the Shias and Sunnis have long-standing disputes that go back almost more than 1,000 years, right? So they created this art. The Western powers have this tendency to create artificial nations by drawing straight lines on the map. So if you look at Africa, it's all straight lines.
Yeah, and that's the sign from a geopolitical perspective of a richer nation f***ing shit up for you. Like, and f***ing shit up for your future. That's what the listeners should know.
So what this does is that it divides communities across nations. And it puts communities that historically don't belong together in the same nation. That causes problems, long-term, very long-term problems. That's what you see in Iraq. That's what you see across the Middle East. Even Saudi Arabia essentially is an artificially created nation. It's never been one nation the way it is today, you know. And the Saudi, the House of Saud is again essentially a client state. It was a client state of the UK. Later on, it became a client state of the US, which it in some ways still is, and so on. It's all about oil. It's all about the resources of the region, and so on.
When did they figure that there's oil in the Gulf?
I think this began in the 19th century, if I'm not mistaken. You know, oil exploration became a big thing. They called it black gold. It was so valuable. That's when the entire world's economy started being driven by oil. Later, you had super tankers. So I'm fast forwarding a little bit more. Sure. But after the Second World War, the super tankers started being used, and the Suez Canal was too narrow for that, so they had to still go around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa.
What is a super tanker?
A super tanker is a massive ship. It's sometimes larger than an aircraft carrier.
Really?
Yes.
And it's purely used for oil?
Yes, it has these small compartments in which you keep oil. It's not a big large compartment, because when the oil sloshes, it can tip the ship over. So they make these smaller compartments, small cells, but it's essentially fully filled with oil.
Wow.
Massive ships.
Okay.
And that's what they used to transport oil. They also had pipelines which went through Asia, but mostly super tankers. And these super tankers eventually were made so big they could not go through the Suez Canal. So they had to anyway go through the Cape of Good Hope route. But that's an aside. So all of these things were happening. The First World War saw the fragmentation of the Ottoman Empire, the nascent creation of what would later on become Israel. And that's where all the territorial disputes started. Two communities, two sets of people seeking the same territory. It was once called the land of the Philistines. Later it was called Palestine. The British Mandate of Palestine, they started settling Jews there. After World War II, they had suffered the Holocaust, and they sought a Jewish nation. In 1948, the first big problem was given to the UN, which had just been formed. Here's your big problem. Deal with it. And then the nation of Israel was created, and the same day it was created, all the neighbors attacked, which was the 1948 Arab-Israeli war, which Israel succeeded in winning. It was a drawn-out conflict. It did not end immediately, but the Israelis succeeded in surviving and defeating the Arab neighbors. Then there were multiple conflicts down the line.
Thank you for watching this clip. If you want to learn more about this topic, we've curated a playlist just for you, and here's a link to the whole episode.